So today I'm talking about changing crops, agricultural practices and foodways in northern Sudan. And in a broader context, crop diversity has been declining over the last century, especially since the last sort of 50, 60 years. But it persists in a lot of local farming communities globally, but continues to be lost. One of the main reasons is the increasing dominance of a narrow range of crops like wheat, maize, and rice grown as monocrops using high input methods. And in northern Sudan, agricultural practices have been changing, mirroring these broader global patterns, and particularly since the replacement of the traditional sagir water wheel by diesel pumps in the mid-20th century. And alongside that, an increased introduction of commercial crop varieties, especially wheat and broad beans. And then more recently, after the completion of the Merowe Dam at around the Fourth Cataract in 2009, the large sort of reduction of the annual flood that had been previously a really key time in the agricultural calendar for millennia. But today, many small farms persist along the river and in villages and islands, alongside varying scales of agricultural schemes, which is highly variable between regions, the sort of size of these schemes. So today I'm going to be mainly talking about looking at local agricultural histories and about some of the perspectives from recent and ancient crop histories that could be useful for present day sustainability debates. So in a broader context about my sort of work in Sudan, I'll just introduce the sort of different interconnected projects. And when I first worked there, was at my first role at the British Museum, doing sort of archaeobotany research at the Amara West research project. And Amara West was an ancient pharaonic New Kingdom town on an island in northern Sudan that you can see in the map on the right near the small town of Abri. And you can see this is like an aerial shot taken from a kite on the left. You can see the town of Amara West in the foreground, and in the back you can see the island, Aneta Island, which is where we all stay when we're working there. Amara West was originally on an island, but a channel around it dried up during the occupation of the site. So this was a sort of late second millennium BC town, and at the time there wasn't much known about the archaeobotany for that sort of time frame. So it was really trying to discover that and see what the preservation was like. But while we were there, we realised that the traditional agricultural practices around us were rapidly changing. So I developed a project to try and look at the traditional agriculture today and how it's changing, and then to have like a long-term look at crop histories. So this picture is some of the Nubian farmers that I was working with on Aneta Island. So in that project had different components, but it was centred on the ethnobotany of Nubian agriculture, and then aimed to contextualise that with other sources, archival literature and other archaeobotanical published sources to get this longer term view. And at the same time I carried on working at the site of Amara West. And then following that I had a connected project that was the main aim of it was to co-produce a community orientated book, and that was something that came up as an idea in the first part of the project, because the local crop histories were not previously documented. Most of the information was in the memory of elderly farmers, and so was endangered. And all this sort of knowledge is a combination of important traditional ecological knowledge, but also equally local cultural heritage. And then after that, when I was working at Kew, I carried on working in Sudan, and with a small fieldwork grant, went back to look at more of the wild plant uses and in exactly the same sort of area, to get a more holistic, wide view of all of the sorts of different plant uses. And that was really interesting because it really showed that pretty much every potentially useful plant was being used. And then this slide introduces some of my collaborators from Sudan, especially Mohammed Hassan and Adam Bashir and Mohammed Saad that work with me in the field. And Maha Kordofani from Khartoum University that helps with all the plant collecting and identifications. And so within the sort of ethnobotanical methods, we're especially trying to inventory all of the different crops grown, uses and relative importance. And within that, I had a particular focus on cereals and pulses for trying to ask more repeatedly to try and get some sort of semi-quantified idea on that. So overall, there was about 42 different crops being cultivated. And they're also looking at, in a kind of descriptive, qualitative way, cultivation methods, crop processing and cooking processes, and then with a real focus on trying to look at changes. And you can see that funny thing on the bottom on there as well, don't mind. The changes in living memory in household farms and Nubian villages. Is there a way to get rid of that? Just seeing that this little thing in there.
I don't think it's all it issues.
It's okay, I can live with it. Oh. Well done. Cool. So before I move from this slide, the map on the left. So the Nubian villages, I was particularly working in the Sukut region, which is where Annetta Island located, and the nearby small town of Abri. And the Sukut is the name refers to the people and the dialects in that Nubian area. So riverine Nubian languages today are still spoken from an area just south of Dongola, a town called Al Daba, all the way through to the first cataract in Egypt. And so these areas of Dongolari, Mahas, Sukut, Helfalaris, Fadija and Kenzi refer to people, the regions and the dialects. And Nubian today is just spoken, but it's also one of the oldest written languages in Africa, with the written form not used much since the last few hundred years. I've just got this additional map showing more the same thing, at different villages that I've visited for interviews, but today I'll mainly talk about the work around Amara, West and Annetta. But we visited these other areas as well for comparison, but like with many sort of fewer interviews.
Now they say that sharing isn't working again.
Oh, you could just see me and no. Gives me a chance to blow my nose anyway. Okay. This map it's useful having a look at the Google Earth maps for this region, because you can really see the transition from more yellow sandy areas to where it starts to become greener, and the rainfall increases, but it's southwards in Sudan, so really have a very changing environment. So in northern Sudan, there's hardly any rainfall, so the relevance of that is, of course, that all the agriculture is very focused on the river, and any rainfall that you do get is mainly in the summer months, and then you can see on the right that starts to increase southwards, so you have a very different scenario by the time you get to Khartoum. And this is collecting plants with Mohammed Hassan, who was with me most of my field seasons there, and he's a Nubian speaker, so he's really the lead in the interviews. So we conducted the interviews in mix of Nubian and Arabic, and documenting the local terms in Arabic and Nubian was very important. You have this in ethnobotany, a really big topic is the idea of biocultural heritage, and thinking these sort of interconnections, and one of those interconnections is about plant diversity and languages, local languages, and but for practical purposes in the interviews, the Nubian words were really useful because they were always very specific per plant. In the case of the crops, more complicated with the wild plants, but they were more specific than the Arabic, which has a lot of aggregate terms. And so when I went back in my second season, I had to reinvestigate a few things that I'd noted from the first season because of these confusers in the Arabic, especially the term lubia, that the main lubia is cowpea, but the term can mean beans generally. Lubias can refer to about 3 different species. If you say the whole word, you kind of get it. So lubia affin or lubia helu are specific, but often people just talk about lubias. But what's interesting about lubias is they do, it is like lab cowpea or pigeon peas, they do grow in the same sorts of settings around the same times. So there's a logic to the terms. And the same with the word durra, which durra is sorghum, but durra shami is maize, and sometimes durras just generically means both of those. But when you see them growing, they grow in the same places at the same sorts of times and look really similar when they're growing. But one problem, of course, was how to transliterate the Nubian terms. In transliterating it into Arabic, obviously logical, but tricky because you don't have all the vowel sounds, and into Latin letters was tricky because obviously I initially transliterated it into English sounds, but that's not what linguists do. They use more continental vowel sounds. So so coming all the way through to this last year is COVID gave good time to do this in more detail. So I was working with a linguist, Marcus Jaeger, so he helped me transliterate my English versions into a sort of proper Latin script sounds. So for example, these EE endings sound is the sound A, so kasha and gay. And then he also transliterated them into contemporary Nubian characters, which are an effort today in Sudan to revive the old alphabet, which is a mix of Coptic and Greek and also some Meroitic letters. But so these letters then put the version that will perfectly keep the sound. So this is a work in progress. And so Inetta Island was a great case study. and really lucky area that we happen to be based in, because the island was car and electricity free, so a lot of traditional practices were still kind of persisting a bit longer than in some places, but it's all on a kind of continuum. So some practices are still persisting and others have stopped in the last sort of recent decades. So in other cases, we'd have to learn about how older practices worked from, farmers. So actually, it made interview process, quite long and involved, because you're documenting what's happening now, but also what's happening in the past and the timing of that, and trying to explore how that has impacted on crops are being grown. But it's a really good exploration of trying to find out the local drivers of change. So for example, the old irrigation technologies that were sort of disappeared more or less by the end of the 70s, and the threshing with donkeys for wheat and barley until the mid 80s, and they used to thresh the other cereals like sorghum with sticks, so sort of variable practices. And now they have like a little portable threshing machine, and they take it in turns to use that. And then you documented as well early on the different agricultural land categories to help better understand where crops were being grown and why they were being grown in these different areas. And so on the island, there's and riverbanks, there's sort of three main categories: the sloping riverbank land, the upper riverbank land, and then the land a little bit further in that's still alluvial soils but is less fertile because it doesn't really get flooded. But those lower and upper bank river areas would always get flooded in the past. So those would be the best areas for growing crops. But today, with the reduced flood, it's just the sloping riverbanks that get flooded, and that upper riverbank land has turned into kind of fixed land and is becoming more like the inner island land. But crucially, you still do get the river being a few meters higher in the summer months. So you can see like a micro version of the past cultivation. And those riverbank areas, which I'll come back to again, you can see in the upper small picture. So the river's high until about September, October, and then recedes. So initially you can cultivate it like you did before, the floodplain with the soils being exposed as the waters go down, and then you plant stuff. But what's really interesting about that riverbank land is after those few months, you can keep growing crops all the way through to the next flood season, so all the way through to the next July, because the crops they grow there are able to reach the water table. So initially they'll plant all the wintry ones and the hot season ones, and then as the months go on, it's just the ones that are a little bit more arid resistant that get planted there. So it's just more pictures of cultivation and irrigation, but just so you get that picture of that small scale irrigation plots and ways of doing things in this region. So every farmer has got their own bubble diesel pump for their farms. Some farmers take boats out and go and farm little alluvial areas in rivers, because that's like extra patches of that best quality riverbank land. And they use these small plots that you can irrigate with these little channels that you can manually sort of open and close to let water in. And then there's that one big pump in the river in the top left that feeds a sort of permanent, quite narrow canal system in Abury. So that canal system is just about a metre wide, and then it goes a few hundred kilometres inland. Not that far, getting kilometres mixed up. It goes further inland than the riverbank farms, but that's a fixed canal, but it's still a lot smaller than you see in areas further south around the Dongle-Reach, where you've got massive canals being built. So these are more like a small scale village, small town level canal networks, and they were built in the 1940s, and they just basically extend that bargeau in land cultivation a bit further, but you don't have those sorts of fixed canals on Veneta, but you have them quite commonly in villages, the main riverbank. So I just have a few plots here comparing some of the crops grown today and in the mid-20th century, just focusing here on the cereals and pulses. In pale green, the mid-20th century, and dark green, the present day, and slightly weirdly sitting there wheat, because it just didn't fit this easy scheme of past and present, because very locally the wheat was introduced in the mid-1950s and then abandoned in 2014, whereas all the other crops were being grown before that. So the main thing is that that you can see from this plot is that far fewer farmers are growing cereals of any kind today, and it's become very pulse dominated. And in fact, broad beans have become the dominant pulse, and that's a bit harder to see on this plot, because it's not showing the amounts being grown, just the numbers of farmers growing it. So there's still lots of farmers growing, for example, cowpea and lablab, a little bit fewer than the past, but they're growing them in much smaller areas. And the other clear one you can see is that lentil has kind of dropped off today. But you can explore these changes in a bit more detail by looking at the changing uses. So on the top is the different sort of basic use categories from the mid-20th century, and then the bottom plot from today. And here they look really different. And the main difference is the key crops that they were using for food in the past: hulled barley, sorghum, cowpea, and lablab, and lupin are just being used by fewer farmers today, or being grown by fewer farmers today as food, more commonly for fodder, and sometimes not at all. And then another difference today then is that more farmers are growing a mix of crops for household use and to sell. So those ones that they sell are basically taking up some of the space. And in some instances, people are now buying things like sorghum and wheat flour from the markets, or ready baked wheat. And broad beans are sort of alongside date palms, the sort of most common crop that people are growing to sell. So you can see these differences again by comparing what crops people describe as the most important. And so the crops that people are describing as the most important in the past are completely reversed from the ones being described as the most important today. And the meaning of importance has shifted as well. So the previous ones were most important as the subsistence food crops, and now the ones being prioritised, the ones being grown to sell. Although to say that broad beans are also now a dominant sort of traditional food crop. So this is some pictures of examples of local crops being grown less today for food. The pearl millet and sorghum cereals. Pearl millets, tiny patches of it, and purely just for fodder. Sorghum is only really grown for fodder now. Hulled barley's hardly grown. There it's grown as an edge plot, but often it's just like literally a handful of plants. And lablab and cowpea, you see a lot around the edges of the island still, especially lablab, but very much just at household scale and more for fodder than food. And although lots of farmers are still growing them, it's often in this sort of context. So this picture shows the riverbank kind of cultivation. So it's a little bit like home gardens, effectively. And so it's a small area, but that hides the fact that you can repeatedly sow crops in it, including at these sort of drier times of year. So it's actually a small area, but very productive, and everything's very highly intercropped there as well. So in the foreground, it's hard to see here, but there's little lab plants with individual barley plants being grown in them, and they're being grown together deliberately to harvest to feed animals. So many of these older crops are in a state of decline. So I've just got a few slides here that gives a few examples. So hulled barley, now an almost forgotten food crop. It was described as the most important winter cereal food crop until the 1960s. And it's stress tolerant and fast growing, but its negative is that it's slow to process, and it's not particularly commercial either. So to explain the processing, there's a picture of a hulled barley grain, and it's after harvesting, it stays still in this quite tightly encasing husk, lemur and palea husk, which is not so great to eat. So, but it's actually quite easy to process. It's just time consuming. So I was shown how it used to be processed in the past. So you just grind it on a grinding stone, and then you can see in the sieve that the little flecks of lemur and palea stay quite distinct from the flour. So you could just sieve it out, but they would sieve it out up to 8 times. So it was just easier to replace by wheat. So sorghum declined as a food cereal, or growing it as a food cereal has declined more slowly, but its advantages were again being very fast growing and heat tolerant, and sorghum varieties you could grow throughout the year. But after the introduction of the diesel pumps, it became non-commercial compared to the rain-fed sector because of the expense of diesel, especially in the summer. And then when fewer farmers were growing it, became more susceptible to bird attacks. So now you still see sorghum being grown a lot in the region, but it's mainly being grown as a fodder, and the birds are eating all of the grains. So they're then being fed the whole plant, but minus the grains. Lab is my favourite crop, and it's an almost forgotten food pulse. Grown in some areas outside of this region as a fodder crop, but it's mainly in this region that it's still remembered by some people as a food crop. But it was described as the most important food pulse in the mid-20th century, a pulse that you could eat every day. And you can sow it at any time of year. So people were just basically growing it on a kind of permanent kind of basis, just resowing it. And the pods regrow, so you can harvest it several times and then feed the whole plant to animal. And you can eat the beans green, and because it's growing so frequently, so it's just basically eaten very frequently as a fresh green pulse, but you could also dry it. And so in the picture you can see what used to be the kind of daily dish that they described that they would make with it, and it would be eaten with bottle gourd, but cooked as a squash. And then this is a picture of some lab seed being dried for the following year. So it's just these older crops being saved as landrace crops. So lupin, another interesting pulse. Can't quite grow it all year. It's mainly a winter pulse, but it's very stress tolerant. So you could see in this picture, it's just being grown on this sandy area. So you really have this idea of any patch of land that something suits being used. So the very patchy cultivation. And its negative is that it requires quite a lot of detoxification processes. And then in an opposite trajectory, you have some crops that were minor crops becoming major crops, particularly broad beans. And you can see from this picture that that's just broad beans as far as the eye could see. And after the problem of bird attacks on wheat, so wheat being grown less since 2015, or not at all on this island, the areas that would have had wheat crops in the winter are now just mainly broad beans, and then on the inner island also some increased cultivation of different spices in the sandy areas. But it's really changed the face of the island, really. So obviously, like the benefits of this are it's a very commercial crop. It's also a successful export crop. It's part of the dominant urban food culture. So it's, you know, when you can make money from selling, and it's also a key part of the modern traditional food culture. So it's used to make full casserole broad beans, which is sort of food that a lot of people eat every day, sometimes for more than one meal a day. But its negative is it's purely one of the winter crops, whereas the other pulse crops were pulses you could cultivate in the winter or summer. But it also needs intensive irrigation, especially the new introduced varieties, the larger varieties since the 1980s that are more commercial but more water dependent. And also the increase of bread wheat over time, although that, of course, that has now stopped being grown. That's a very commercial crop, obviously, and again, part of the modern traditional food culture. But again, winter only and needing intensive irrigation. But this picture is a picture I took back in 2011, so you could see then that you still had fields of wheat, and today that sort of area will just be broad beans or vegetables and spices. But it's slower to grow than the hulled barley or sorghum. So hulled barley was, you know, the other main winter cereal before, and that only takes 90 days to grow. So a really big difference was that when they started growing wheat in the 50s and 60s, it had to always be with the water wheel and then the diesel pumps. They couldn't grow it on the riverbank areas using the flood recession, because in comparison to Egypt, where you've got really flat areas of floodplain, here the riverbanks are quite slopey, so the higher areas start to dry out a bit faster. So something like barley was work in that context because it's faster growing, but the soils would dry out too fast for the wheat. So it was basically a popular crop, but difficult to grow before the diesel pumps. And then another factor has been that there was a lot of cultivars introduced. So when I went in 2014 and it was still being grown, I tried to document some of the different varieties. So there is a Belody, which just means local variety. So that was sort of like a Sudanese landrace. And then these other varieties were ones introduced from the 70s or 80s, and there were various ones coming in and out. But they all have different growing seasons. And so farmers explained that one of the problems was that they were basically all ripening at different times. And so if people grew the same type of wheat over a large area, it mitigated the bird attacks. But if you grew things that ripened in little patches here and there, the birds would basically eat this patch that day, this patch another day. And then that became worse when they changed the threshing method, because it was more coordinated before, and then it became very different times using the threshing machine. So bird attacks had always been a problem. You see references to it in literature all through the 20th century, but the traditional cropping practices basically managed to mitigate it. So with the change in irrigation and the end of the flood, there's a really big difference between the cultivation patterns and seasonality and land use from the mid 20th century to present day. So I try to do these little diagrams to try and share it. So this is a mid 20th century when basically every patch of land was used through the year, but it really tracked the movements of the floods. So this is like a profile of the island, and that blue dotted line is supposed to be the flood. So the flood could reach basically as far as the Palm Belt here, and then when the river was high between July and August, they would grow crops on the inner island, so the like heat tolerant crops, the lab cowpea and sorghum especially, and that was a really important season because it was very easy to use the sagia when the water was high. And then after that, as the water receded from August, September onwards, they'd plant more of the heat tolerant crops, but also the range of winter crops. And then as that started to dry out on the top upper riverbank, they would plant more winter crops and the sagia irrigation on the top, on the like the upper riverbank and going inland. And then at the same time, then from April to July, that continual riverbank cultivation using the groundwater irrigation. And then today, it's that little dotted line is supposed to represent the smaller flood that you get today now that the dam has reduced it. And so that whole upper riverbank and inner island area is just fixed land with the diesel pump irrigation. And although there's a few summer crops grown, it's dominantly through the winter season. And but then you still get this continual, almost year-round cultivation of the lower riverbank areas with initially the winter crops and then ongoingly the heat-tolerant crops. So although you get a big difference between the mid-20th century and today, the timing of key crop changes is a bit variable by crop. So this diagram was to try and illustrate that because it doesn't really get captured on the graphs, and it's just to mainly highlight the contrast between barley and sorghum, for example, with barley being rapidly replaced as a food crop and sorghum more gradually. So it just means that there's not exactly the same reason for all the crop changes, and it's sort of slightly different narratives. And overall, just to highlight that there is a very wide range of legume diversity being consumed and grown before, and then that has gradually reduced. So alongside these changes, kind of paralleled by some changes in the food culture. So especially the flatbreads used to be more common. They're still grown today, but now baked wheat bread is more of the dominant daily food, eaten with every meal. And also a big difference was that the flatbreads before were made with a really wide range of flours, including pulse flours. And today it's mainly it's wheat or sorghum, with often the sorghum flour being bought. And also it's sort of more flatbreads on the island of Annetta than in the local town, and it ties into things as well like architectural changes, with fewer houses having the traditional kitchens that had the sorts of stoves that you would use to make the flatbreads. So there's many drivers of change, as well as the irrigation, which feeds into things like the crop production costs and the food cultures, food processing methods, other factors like road building. There was a new road from Egypt through to Dongola and Khartoum that really opened up the trade opportunities. And then I think the impact of the Merowe Dam was obviously with the more sort of less with the annual flood. But there's also these other changes, like areas of riverbank land becoming more eroded, and then less silt in some of the irrigation water. So there's some more trajectories of change that will probably become more clear what they are in the future. So just a few slides on a kind of longer term view of these crop histories, just to see how the contemporary crops would compare with the long term past. So in the region, archaeobotanical remains are studied from some of the archaeological sites, and that's mainly macrobotanical remains, which is charred but sometimes also desiccated because of the dry conditions, seeds and other plant parts. So there's a picture of a charred hulled barley grain from Amara West. At that site, the late 2nd millennium BC, the cereals were dominated by hulled barley and emmer wheat, so still Near Eastern winter crops. And then there's also microbotanical remains, especially phytoliths, which are plant cell silica bodies. And those have only been studied from a few sites in Sudan so far, but they were really useful for some of the early period sites and showing when the earliest agriculture in Sudan. But overall, there's really major geographic and temporal gaps, so it's not possible to really model changes in too much detail, but it is possible to assess like a bit of an overview of key crop histories and how long different crops have been grown in the region. So I just summarise that really briefly. So emmer wheat and hulled barley were the sort of long-term crops grown since the Neolithic, since around 7,000 years ago. And then later on, more crops kept being added to this sort of mix, especially to point out the introduction of these summer growing cereals. And sorghum was first grown in the 1st millennium BC, but just like at a small scale, and then it became a more dominant crop in the 1st millennium AD, possibly becoming more important then, because it would have been easier to grow with the water wheel, which was introduced about 300 AD. And hulled barley seems to have stayed important to the present day, but emmer wheat, we're not quite sure how long that was grown for. I met one farmer who did describe something like emmer wheat, but it's not around today. And the history of free threshing wheats, red wheat and hard wheat, is still being unravelled, but initially when it was introduced, it seems to have become regionally more minor for a while. And a similar picture with pulses, with initially just the sort of Near Eastern winter pulses that could be grown in the winter months, and then the introduction as well of pulses that could be grown in hotter months. And this just shows it again, but in a slightly easier to follow probably chronology, and just basically to make the point that originally it was based on winter crops, and then a range of summer and winter crops through to the present day, but that today it's become more based on winter crops again because of these modern cultivars and shift to using diesel pumps. And one difference in that really early time frame when winter crops were really important was that there was a bit of a different local environment. There were these pictures of seasonal river channels about 20 to 30 kilometres north of Annetta and Avery. So in that one region, they're quite common still, but more broadly throughout the north, they're now really rare. But it seems that they were actually very common before the 1st millennium BC, and that then they started to dry up. And so that would have really started to have reduced the kind of areas that you could be depending on these winter crops. And that's definitely sort of what happened around the town of Amara West. So after that, growing a mix of winter and summer crops became essentially a risk management strategy all the way through to around the 1980s. And this Google Earth image of a netta, you can see all of the areas in green that are being cultivated in the winter season. And then in contrast, in the summer season, only very small areas being cultivated today. But farmers said that before it was just the same in the summer. They cultivated that kind of extent all year. So it's essentially a shift from growing lots of crops in multiple ways to manage agricultural risk to a focus on yield and commercial crops. But these older crops are all more arid tolerant and low input than the newer ones. And this sort of cultivation in these riverine areas that, you know, at times of year where they're being grown without any extra irrigation suggests very locally adapted crops and land races, reflecting, you know, on one hand that antiquity of cultivation and to local environments. So as well as the loss of these sorts of varieties, all the associated traditional knowledge and other traditional practices, there's sort of complex range of intercropping that's sometimes tied to uses and sometimes tied to environmental benefits, and changes to the useful weedy flora. So, for example, all of the kinds of useful weeds that are vaguely edible be collected and fed to animals, because there's very much a pressure here on collecting enough plants to feed to animals. Having enough space to grow fodder crops is now complicated because of the space used for commercial crops. So a lot of this local knowledge is in elderly farmer memories and is essentially accessible through talking to them and using sort of oral history approaches. And most of these sorts of recent crop changes have not been documented, and that's the same sort of story in lots of countries. And these sorts of narratives of these local crops and these what now look like minor crops generally get overlooked in the larger narratives that are focused on developing the commercial ones. So broadly, a lot of today's sort of minor and orphan food crops were previously important subsistence crops. And so trying to unravel the recent past and connect it with the ancient past as well, that can then give a sort of deep time perspective that highlights the environmental suitability of local crops on one hand, from how farmers describe their benefits and how they can grow them, and then on the other hand with the information from the archaeological record that suggests that people have been growing them for millennia. So these sorts of really resilient, well-adapted local species could be important for coping with future climate change, but it's the knowledge around those and the actual diversity itself that are today endangered. And this is just a slide from some of the community work when we were distributing the book in local villages and schools. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philippa, for this very interesting talk. And I see a lot of interesting parallels to the work we're doing on Sai Island, one of these islands that is close by. So I think we've already had many interesting discussions and we'll have a lot more. Question I wanted to ask, how do you look at the role of the import of cheaper grain in the move from broad beans to from cereals, away from cereals to broad beans? Because one of the things in Sudan is, of course, there's a lot of state subsidies on bread and on grain, and there's maximum prices, and they're very low, of course, because the government wants to try and keep the rebellion that now happened from happening. Do you think that played a role? Because some of the farmers were also complaining about things like that, and about larger companies buying a lot of land for potato farms, Egyptian companies. Do you think that could have played a role as well, in addition to the birds, the shift?
Well, wheat has been promoted through the region through the 20th century. So it's been generally a policy within agriculture to introduce food. And I think the problem of growing wheat would have been okay if it hadn't had the bird attacks. But even with that, there's huge amounts of wheat being imported. So basically, I guess a mismatch between to grow enough of it, because it is sort of production of it is centred in the north where you have cool enough waters, because as soon as you start to go further south, then in the areas where the rainfall starts to get a little bit higher, then so the temperatures start to get a bit higher as well. So yeah, it's a tricky one, but it's now something that's eaten all the time as baked bread, so it's hard to retract from that, I guess. But it's still grown a lot in other regions, like in Dongola Reach. There's the bird attacks isn't such a big issue because it's just been grown on a large scale, and a lot of the schemes, many of which have been built from the 1940s and 50s onwards, further inland than the river. So I think the birds are particularly bad around Annetta. There's lots of wild vegetation and there's just birds flying all the time. So I think the degree to which that's a problem is highly variable between villages.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions?
Yeah, very nice talk. Question I had is
No, so actually in the small scale farms, so if they're growing broad beans, for example, that's taken up a really big area of the fields. They're eating them and selling them. And then the other main crop that they're growing to sell is the date palms, which is a very historic crop. But when it's being grown on the farms, again, it's a mix of using it and selling it. And then the scenarios where the crops are being grown purely to sell is more in the schemes that have been developed, and there's varying scales of those. So even at the sort of village level or small town level, so in Avery, when you get further back from the riverine farms and you have some farmers with land that's mainly on the Barjou land, then they're growing more crops to sell than the island farm. Partly though, because they're also right next to the market, so they don't have to. It's that proximity to markets and roads also makes a big difference for that. But there's not many big schemes in that area, but when you get down towards Dongola, then you really have a juxtaposition between small-scale family farms, which have elements of commercial stuff going on, and then really big schemes with sometimes some of them run entirely as commercial ventures with hired on them, and then some of the older schemes are sort of split into farms that people are more like kind of standing tenant farms.
How is that?
Well, I think in general it's been mainly subsistence farming, but then in pharaonic Egypt there's the state management aspect of that, so it's a little bit different per period of time. Not really sure what to say for that in the Bereritic. In Nubian, the medieval Nubian kingdoms, there definitely seems to be family ownership of farmland, and the date palms there were owned between generations of this textual evidence. People are talking about inheriting date palms and things, but I found some interesting like archival evidence for date palms being traded with Egypt back from So the text states the early 1800s, so it suggests 1700s, and who knows since when that sort of trade. So dates especially had a special value. I think they're just these little sparrow things, but not that good at birds. But mainly little sparrow things. So even in the Nubian house where we live, you know, it's just absolutely full of birds. You have to remember to keep the kitchen door shut, because otherwise you'll open it and like 10 birds will come out.
Question from the chat, and then from Christopher Vincent. What is your impression of how changes? They feel these changes represent a process or something else?
The elderly farmers really liked talking about the practices, and said otherwise it was something that they didn't talk about that much. So I think the heritage aspect of it and the resilience aspect of it was something that in those conversations was always particularly highlighted. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that for some of the younger generations. I think we'd almost need to do a larger social science survey, but it was really interesting when I was doing the community book, like having the illustrations, and it was really useful because actually for even things, especially for the shadoof, I was talking to one of the farmer's daughters. There are lots of people who are away at university now. Everyone goes to school. A lot of people go to university away in Donglo or further, and a lot of young men go to work as well. So you have a feeling of being more disconnected from learning cultural practices, and then for things like the saga and shadoof that have disappeared, some people have not seen them or seen pictures of them. So it's a mix, but it's definitely the traditional agriculture is seen as cultural heritage as well.
Just one comment. Speaking about language, words for crops, and I know they're using counties, and in the early 30s, and actually were for different areas. So I know that Nubia, these words that wondering also by other crops now, or just
I might have got it wrong in that table. I'm going to have a. Oh, there's a slide I didn't show. I'm just going to go back to my crop list because
it's possible they're using a different.
Lubia affin is only
word,
lab. Lubia affin is definitely only lab. So if I've said cowpea in here, I've just done it wrong. The cowpea is Lubia hilu, and so Lubia hilu means sweet bean, and then
Halwa,
yeah.
Or halu, yeah.
And then for the lab, Lubia affin means stinking bean, which is like not such a great name for it. So actually locally they really call it the Nubian name Kashrangay, and sometimes Lubia, but I didn't hear many people call it Lubia affin. But in the Dongla area, in the interviews there, it was well, I was using more Arabic in that area because the local Nubian is a bit different. It's not all the same crop names, and there was a little bit less lab being grown, I guess partly because a lot of the interviews were a bit further inland. But there it was commonly called Lubia affin, but it was also commonly being grown as a fodder crop. And it is really quite a smelly bean, the flowers. So it is definitely, as the word says, but it's very easy to identify it. Like visually and by smell as you walk past it growing. But and for taste, cowpea is sweeter. Lablab's got quite a bitter taste, but that's this Lubia issue of the word was definitely one reason why the Nubian words were so useful. But so the Lubia got used commonly, but these fuller names that I have there, they were actually not that commonly used locally.
Common terms that
Oh.
Have some cows. Oh yeah, that's basically. I took that at one of these schemes inland of the Dongla area. So you don't actually see any ploughing like that in the Aneta area, probably in the past, but in the inland of Dongla, where you've got some big schemes. This was a brigade scheme built in the 80s over these large tracts of Jew lands. Needs a lot more management to the yeah, definitely. There's hardly any cattle and cows kept up in the Aneta Abri region. The Aneta Island, everyone used to have a few for operating Lagia water reels, and they would have to grow a lot of fodder crops to feed them. It was easy to grow lots of fodder crops as Saluka crops, flood drawdown. That would, so the lab and cowpea especially would be grown over large areas to feed them. But after the reduction of the flood, it was basically hard to grow as much fodder crops. So basically there's as much of a change in fodder crop histories as food crop histories, and so now it's quite expensive to feed your animals, so this practice of having to collect all of the wild plants for them sort of reflects that. So people are keeping mainly a few sheep and goat, and maybe only about cows and grass, but lots of families don't have any, but sometimes you see a lot more in areas of the there's different riverine morphology, so you have some areas, inland lakes especially, or you have a lot more, essentially some grassland, so people, animals out grazing, but you can't let any animals out grazing, because every little bit of land that can be is cultivated, so animals basically stay tethered or in their pens. Also changed the milk culture. So the milk culture was actually a really part of the diet before be seen as a food, and now you don't see much fresh milk.
Thank you again, Philippa. I better not touch it. So our next speaker is Professor Dr. Emeritus Peter Scholliers. Peter studied history here at VUB, where he also obtained his doctorate. Peter was professor at the history department of VUB from 2000 until his retirement in 2018. It was here that he in 2003 founded the research group FOST, social and cultural food studies, with which you are probably all familiar by now, of which he was director until 2015. FOST is an interdisciplinary research group, the way that Peter set it up, and focused on all aspects of food history in the broader sense, and also takes an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach, and includes many scholars from outside of history. And it's a legacy that we are proud to continue here at FOST today, and it also resonates really well with our current BrIAS team on food. Peter has had a long and very distinguished career, being one of the real superstars of food history. He has researched, published and taught and supervised on virtually all topics related to food history, including the history of the standard of living, food and nutrition, material culture and industrial heritage, and also on topics such as food-related health issues, obesity, the concept of the kilocalorie, the history of the restaurant and the labor market of cooks. All of this typically with a focus on Europe from the 18th century onwards. Recently, he has focused on the history of bread and pastry and has published a new book in Dutch, Brood, een geschiedenis van bakkers en hun brood. Peter also is on the editing board, or is editor of many leading interdisciplinary food journals and periodicals, including Food and Foodways, Food, Culture and Society, Food and History, and Appetite. And today, Peter will be talking to us on the gastronomy of Brussels as capital of Europe. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Peter.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for being here. I'm delighted to be here. This is a totally different talk than the previous one, as you will hear, and I hope you will enjoy it. It's a cultural history of the restaurant in Brussels. I myself am from Brussels. I've been educated at this university. I lived here all of my life almost, and I'm not that actually as much as a restaurant visitor. So my idea would actually be to invite you all to go to a restaurant this afternoon, this evening. Unfortunately, BrIAS has no funding for that, so it will be on the theoretical level. Okay, and so gastronomy in the capital of Europe. Okay. Yeah, this is the content of my talk. First of all, I need to give some background information about Brussels in the 19th and the 20th and the 21st century. I realize this will not be new to you. Nevertheless, I have to talk about it. Then I will talk about the history of the restaurant, very briefly, although this is a very, very interesting history, not just in Brussels, of course, but also in France and the rest of the world. Then I will take you to a search to find an own identity of this city in terms of culinary culture, and to end by talking about the Brussels identity of food today. So it will be a very cultural history, unlike the agricultural history that you presented, and unlike the talks, the speeches that you heard before. Nevertheless, it's important talking about the history of restaurants, about culinary history for various reasons. First of all, a lot of people have earned their living in the restaurant businesses and the catering businesses. And secondly, especially after the COVID pandemic that we still live through, by the way, not only in Belgium, but throughout the world, people have a really urge to go out and dine. So also on the cultural level, the mentality of people, it's important. Having said this, and before I start with my talk, I have to stress that so far there is no Ukrainian restaurant in Brussels. I think there are 3 Ukrainian restaurants in Belgium, one in Arlon. You know where this is, Arlon? It's the south of the province of Luxembourg, and 2 in Ghent. But I'm sure there will be more Ukrainian restaurants coming up when they will change from Russian restaurants to Ukrainian restaurants. Okay, having said this, of course, this refers to what's going on in Europe, and I thought I needed to say something about it. Anyway, 19th century Brussels. First of all, there is a very strong population growth. This is not exceptional for Belgium or Brussels. it is something that we know throughout Europe, and not just in the west, but also in the south, the east, and that's it. So you have a couple of figures. Centre means the Vijfhoek, the old center of Brussels, which an important road in the 19th century. But then I also include the data for the Brussels conurbation, the 19 communes, which is much more important and which nowadays makes one big conurbation. And actually, it's more than these 19 communes, because you could extend it to Wezenbeek, even to Tervuren, other places surrounding, like any other big city. So this population growth implies a huge economic development. I could give a lecture on that, but I won't do it. Just to mention a report of the 1905 Board of Trade, the British Board of Trade, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, inquiring about the competition in Europe for the British industries, and saying that Belgium might be a danger, and especially Brussels, which is great and growing prosperity. There is a seaport. I don't know whether you realize this, but Brussels nowadays has a seaport. As you know, there is no sea so far. But it means that there is a huge exchange of people, of ideas, and of goods. And the British Board of Trade knows this very well. So Brussels is a hub of finance, of seats, of big companies, of banks, and in that sense, it's an important but a small city. And this appears also in its political meaning, significance. It has been a capital before 1815. Perhaps you know, but in 1815 there was this union between the Netherlands, present-day Netherlands, and present-day Belgium, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands for 15 years. Brussels was the capital city together with La Haye every other year. So very strange, but that was the case. In 1830, Brussels became the capital of this new ruling kingdom, Belgium. And in 1988, and I want to stress this, Brussels is also the capital of the Flemish community. Some people tend to forget this. By the way, it's not sure that it will be like that for the country. But being a capital implies that there is a presence of the court, the kingdom, the king lives in Brussels, the big political institutions like the parliament, but also the ministries are present in Brussels, and also a lot of embassies, which attracts a lot of people from out of Belgium coming to Belgium. So it's a center of political power. But together, it's also a center of the protest against that political power. And this leads to international appeal. Many people from other countries stay for a shorter or a longer while in Brussels. And this appears also on the cultural level. There are a lot of events with, if you wish, symbolic value occurring in Brussels. Just to mention museums, okay, scientific congresses, very important, the Solvay meeting, in Solvay. 11. But I want to stress the world exhibitions, of which there were 4 in Brussels, and there were other exhibitions in Belgium, in Antwerp, Ghent, in Charleroi, and Liège, but Brussels had 4 of them, attracting millions of people from Belgium, of course, but also from other countries all over the world. So it's so finally, this city, because of its economic, political, cultural importance, has also a lot of social importance. Just stressing that the working class movement was pretty important in this city in the 19th and the 20th centuries. and it's a place still nowadays of protest. A lot of meetings, protest meetings, happen not in Antwerp or Liège or Ghent or wherever, it's Brussels with specific particular places, especially since Brussels has become the unofficial capital of the EU, which is no surprise that it became that it was suggested to become the unofficial capital of Europe in the 1950s, because of all the reasons I just. Voila, this is very short the presentation of a city of Brussels in the 19th and the 20th century, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this information. Now, the second part is the culinary culture of the city. Here you see an image of Hotel Bellevue, which was one of the most important, and I know what I'm saying, hotels in Europe in around 1800, 1810. So a lot of people would go there from Britain, from the US, from France, from Germany, from the Netherlands, from Poland, and meet and have contacts, do businesses with each other. And it had a restaurant, talk about it later, one of the most famous restaurants of the city. So what I did is to take a look at the Botanic, like they call it, address where all restaurants are listed. I have to provide a definition of what a restaurant is. When I use the restaurant in the 19th century, it's not in the sense that we use it nowadays. It differs. Restaurants in the 19th century is a very fancy place. It's a copy of what emerged in Paris in the 1780s or in the late 1770s, a very posh place where the elite would go to meet and to eat, to dine, and to spend lots of time and lots of money. I won't discuss this because that again would be a separate talk. Very interesting. So what I did is to take a look at these sources, 19th century, and to count, which is a difficult thing because of the definition what a restaurant is. It's not an estaminet in Flemish. It's not a cafe. Again, this is a different meaning. We talked about language. Huh? A cafe nowadays has a different meaning. Got to the early 19th century, cafe was a very fancy place. Not a restaurant. It's not an auberge, it's not an inn, etc., etc. A restaurant is a restaurant, so it has to be very clear what it is. Very fancy place. Actually, I should talk about the Parisian style restaurant. Very clear what I'm talking. So, in 1820, I found 7 of them. That's not a lot. The increase of 1900, end of the 19th century, is 12. An increase of almost 5% per year, which is pretty. These are 2 places. One place still is very important. This is the era of the Botanic in Brussels. This is the Place du Musée, Brussels, which is nowadays not any longer a type of restaurants, but this one still is. So what I try to do is to put little dots of all places of restaurants to see where these restaurants appear. I mentioned the word, not restaurants, but restaurateur, because this is the word that was used in the 19th century in France and countries as well. Very simply said, it's a guy, a caterer, who produces food qui restaure. That's the simple of the word. So he is a restaurateur. He does not own a restaurant. So the word restaurant appears in the 1830s and 1840s. So I just listed a couple of names to show that a lot of these places imitate not only in the way to serve or to cook, or serve the food, but also in the names. Le Flandre, Bellevue, it's very Brussels. But au Gastronome, les Royales, les Montval, Véloum, Neuf-à-la-Mode, Trois-Frères Sauvager, all these names of restaurants are copied from Paris. And they don't only copy the names, but they also copy the way of presentation, the food, way of cooking. The reasons for expanding the number of restaurants, first, there is a huge demand by the eaters, the diners. Because of this international position of Brussels that I mentioned earlier, a lot of people live in Brussels coming from Britain, a very rich country, from France, really rich, from Germany, and these people are migrants, not necessarily poor migrants, on the contrary. Just to give one example, a lot of people coming from France as refugees would not go to Switzerland, to Geneva, for instance, where they also speak French, but would come to Brussels for the very simple reason that the cost of living is much lower in Brussels than in Geneva. Nowadays, it's the fact, but especially in the 19th century. So a lot of French refugees, rich people fleeing from the regime in France and establishing themselves in. Secondly, also the local people started to discover the charms of eating out, and they have increasing purchasing power. So one of the things I did not mention earlier when I presented Brussels is that social inequality in the city was huge, was very important. Very, very rich people live in Brussels. Very poor people also live in Brussels, and the two go together in the night. So the demand by the diners is increasing fast. Secondly, there is this supply of catering business. Caterers see an opportunity to open a restaurant to gain a good living, and they start with very fancy places to eat, but also with more popular places to eat. And you can read about this in the 1850s when I think particularly of one book that was published 1854, sorry, by a French guy, this book was meant to show the French refugees where to eat, where to stay, what to do in Brussels. And there are a couple of pages where it says, well, if you're well off, you can have a very nice dinner in one of these very nice restaurants in Brussels. But if you're not that rich, you can go in that place where you have for 1.5 Belgian francs a very nice meal, and you have enough, and you have beer, and you have bread, etc., etc. So there are different types of restaurants. And these people, these entrepreneurs, they use very, very intensively workers coming from France, and they send own cooks and own garçon servants to France to learn how to cook, how to serve. So there's this very intense change between Brussels and Paris, and between Paris and the rest of France, and Brussels and the rest of Belgium and the Netherlands, etc., to learn actually how to cook in the French way. I stress this for the very simple reason that this has an immediate effect on the way the people in Brussels eat fancy restaurants, because it's a copy of what is cooked and served in Paris. And there are some quotes. This is Urbain de Rue, Bruxelles, 1803, a tourist guide, if you wish, and he takes a lady to visit Brussels, and he says, let's know, madame, if you want to go in the neighborhood of the Parc, And afterwards, if you allow me, I will take you to the Hotel de Flandre, I already mentioned, where, and this is important, when I read this, by the way, I love the quote, where one dines as well as les Very, les Robert, les Louis Paris. These are three restaurants. Imagine if you're interested in the best restaurant, I'm sure you can name some restaurants, but it's just making a comparison with the best restaurants of the world. Paris. It's saying it's giving a certification of quality. But there is a big difference. It's much cheaper than in Paris. And there are a lot of other references to Brussels restaurants in the early 19th century. This one is from 1827, again, Guy de Voyageur, a travel guide, saying that previously, 1927, there were a few restaurants, almost non-restaurants in Brussels. Les cabarets, some kind of very simple cafes. But finally, finally, several restaurants want to imitate the restaurants in that type, like in Paris. Then it goes on to mention cafes again, Café des Domino, and others that are places where you could have a very nice dinner. I could go on by naming a lot of references to Brussels restaurants in the 19th century. A perfect coffee, actually, is served in Paris, and not France. It is really Paris, only cheaper. 1878, Baedeker, it exists nowadays, by the way. These restaurants are elegant, just like those of Paris, à la carte. That's it. It's not a menu, but you can choose. All there is excellent, but of course it is expensive. Then, around 1900, things started to change. Various reasons that were explained within it. And this is a long quotation written by a French Parisian journalist, the Figaro Illustré of 1910. By the way, 1910, it's the year of the World Exhibition in Brussels. And this guy travels to Brussels and writes a report also on the restaurants. And this is an interesting quote, I think, because it differs from the previous quotes in that it is much more than referring to Paris. It is pointing to an own identity of Brussels restaurants, naming a couple of dishes. The people from Brussels have in Europe first place like one famous gastronomy. If you can distinguer, okay, French people like to say the same thing twice. And they are connoisseurs, they know about food. When Brussels offers to the interested tourists nice walks, gastronomic walks, that you cannot do in any other city of the world. Okay, this is written by, not a Belgian, by a French guy. Then you can find the good bourgeois cuisine, which makes difference with the Parisian fancy cuisine. So this guy is discovering local cuisine. Then he names a lot of typical, so-called typical Belgian and not Brussels dishes like pâtes au poulet. This is interesting, short by the way. Pâtes zo is cooking, so it means cooking water. So, oiseau sans tête, do you know about this dish? Birds without a head. I have to mention les moules marinières d'Anvers, marinated mussels from Antwerp. They do not come from Antwerp. So this is a very nice appropriation of food. The reasons for this Discovery of Brussels or Belgian cuisine around 1900, 1910, before the First World War. First of all, French gastronomy is renewing itself. I can mention one name, Auguste Escoffier, perhaps you heard of him. He was a cook from the south of France who traveled to Paris and then worked in London for a very long time. He wrote a couple of books, journalist, and he renovated the cuisine and labeled it La Nouvelle Cuisine, something that we heard in the night. And he discovers the regional cuisine. From the south, he introduces olive oil, for instance, but he also discovers Belgian cuisine, as well as the Turkish, the Russian, the Italian cuisine, trying to incorporate it in the French cuisine, which, by the way, is the best of the world. So what he does is, you can imagine that what he tries to do is to imagine the French haute cuisine as a sponge that is absorbing all other good cuisines of the world. And the Brussels cuisines, the Belgian cuisine, was one of them. This also is a period with swiftly developing tourism. People started to travel by train and by boat, etc. A lot of Americans visit Europe. A lot of people from England come to the continent. Accommodation is developing, and restaurant businesses are also developing. Actually want to taste the land. This is an expression that appears after the First World War. And again, I have to stress this because Belgium was seen as a violated country, violated by the Germans. And a lot of people from Britain, but also from the US and France, and also of Europe, wanted to visit Belgium to see where the battlefields occurred. And they did that also because of the huge inflation in Belgium, and it was very cheap to travel to Belgium. And all this leads to this new development of or a discovery rather of Belgian local and Brussels cuisine. And this is an example of a menu card that was offered by the Brussels restaurant owners to a delegation from the United States when these restaurant and hotel owners visited, and they stayed for 1 week in Belgium, Brussels, and they were offered, of course, the best. No, this is, I wrote an article about this menu, where language was really important. If you're from Belgium, you see immediately why this would be. It's an equilibrium exercise between Wallonia, southern part of Brussels, central part, Brabant if you wish, and Flanders. Of course, Joinville refers to the First World War. But then you have the Trip de la Semois, Semois being La Couleur de Bruxelles, Brussels, Memory des Ardennes, again, second reference. Les géants de Malines, these asparaguses, Malines. Le chauffeur Bécasse de Placé du Plus, cultural reference. La salade Rubens, Rubens, of course referring to Antwerp, second reference. The fraises de Oulart, Chantilly, Oulart, a village nearby Brussels in Brabant. So you have two references to Flanders, two to Wallonia, and two to Brabant. This is Belgium. This is a nice equilibrium. It's no coincidence, by the way. But it's very Belgian, it's very local. And this is a very clear evidence of the discovery, may I say so, of this local cuisine. So my last part of my short talk is to see what happens after the 1920s in terms of own identity construction. So it's clear that there is some own identity. How does it develop? What I did is to use a very nice collection of menu cards by the Groupe BrIAS de Gastronomie Belgique that was established in 1938. And they, fortunately, they put a lot of menu cards on their website. So that's the address if you're interested in this. There are, I think, hundreds of menu cards. So it's a great source of. So what I did is to take a look. It took me a long time. Fascinating to see what are the stresses in these menu cards in terms of references to geographical references to big chefs, etc. And I'm going to, well, I made a selection, a very selection to present to you some examples. This is late 1950, by the Club des Gastronomes. So this is people that go anywhere, just like that. It's well prepared and it's done. Go some places, it's very well studied. Asperges en branche à la flamande, frette, mocha crème. So there is some reference to Belgium, not a very. And then I started to search further to find some reference to Belgium, Brussels, etc. And I did find quite a lot of them. And I just put some on the screen. It's not just Brussels, it's Belgium. Choosers, pancreas. It's very Brussels. So I don't think you have it in. It seems to be, yeah. What do you have? So there is this. Seems to be very fun. I never tasted it. Very good. But trafiche de Chimay, you know, fruit de la laisse, the river, waterzooi, again, asperge de Malines, gantoise, jambon du pays, consommé de jeunes, etc. But it tends to decline in the course of the 1960s, to almost vanish. So I put in 1990 one example to show the differences with this way. And this is nice because this is a menu card that was kept. Someone wrote comments and also gave marks on the quality. It's nice. 9.75 for the service, etc. So the 8 only for the pois caramélisé au miel, épices et glaces pistachées. It's only an 8 out. The rest is okay. Take a look. It's Huître des Zélandes, Champagne, langoustine, turbo, crevette grise. They don't come from stems, just to come from. It's not mentioned. Badou braisé, moutarde de mots, etc. There is no reference whatsoever to Belgium. This is one example out of many. Okay, the next. What happened? We know what happened actually, right? 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s changed, and there is a breakthrough of modern cuisine connected to the and especially going bio, right? These peaks of restaurants, and they discover that French cuisine, of course, is still not understand, but there are much more influences outside Europe becoming global. Foreign, especially Asian not just in the part of the ingredients, but also with regard. So this is a period when you have big play. You still have that much very well placed. As a consequence, local and European cuisines and specialties. And I try to certify this by taking a look at the number in restaurant of the sort of restaurants that is presented in Brussels. And this in the percent in the 1960s, Franco-Belgian cuisine is about 80% of the total, meaning that Asian, Italians, and other people are minority. Take a look at the development, 72, 61, and today only 12% of the restaurants label themselves nowadays in Brussels as Franco-Belgian. So this is really a shrinking. Of course, Asian, Asian means only Chinese or Japanese and restaurants, and this is really important. Minority in the 60s, increasing very slowly up to 13 in the 1990s, but in the 1990s and the 2000s, with European countries still very important, but also Africa, South America, and disease that. I'm almost done. Just make some general observations. Brussels gastronomy today. I have to remind that Belgium and Brussels is the best pupil. France, even still nowadays, and I'm sure some of you will still unknown. I know that Denmark and Catalonia are much more important. Still nowadays, France is a norm in many countries. But Belgium and Brussels not just imitate French cuisine, they add something. Something is important, but I have no time to go into. Also, it's important to realize that this Belgian Brussels cuisine is internationally recognized. Only after the First World War, it's difficult. I know I showed you this reference from 1910, but especially in the 1930s and especially after the Second World War, Belgian cuisine is being presented not only by Belgians, but also by foreigners as Europe's best kept secret. And this implies that there is not just like in Belgium, but all is more attention paid to such restaurants nowadays. He wants to see the chef and ask where does the greens, the vegetables come from. And I don't need to mention this, that organic, vegan, and exotic cuisine. So, before I come to my conclusions, two examples of cuisine that exists in 2020. It's a restaurant of the Steenweg, which if you know, right in the center of Brussels, called Viva Bomma. From Flanders, you know, the sun. You say Viva Bomma? Yes, Botanic potatoes with sausages. And if you take a look at this, if you can read it, it's very traditional, very local, very a lot of meat to the restaurant. So there are references to Brussels and Belgium. On the contrary, there's only one reference in this restaurant It's the country soir. It's 2 Michelin stars now. One 10 years ago, and there is no reference whatsoever to Belgian except Velcola. Chocolate, but Bel stands of course for. But the rest is very international. So this is the conclusion, 5 steps to the final line. First, in the 19th century, the basis of really fancy cuisine is. But there is trickle down this fancy cuisine, drug, cuisine, and in the end also to neighboring craft. Of course, there is no link whatsoever to that fancy cuisine, which people working across. But there are some trickle down fish, for instance. Very working class with their mussels and herring and that's it. 1920s, working class different mussels and even salmon, which was really expensive. So that's the basis. Second, around the 1910s, for the First World War, there is this discovery of the local they use terroir, which is very difficult to translate into, because it's not just the ground where you live, it's culture. The terroir is becoming much more important, also in the fancy cuisine, and Belgium is part of that. In the 1930s, it's very clear, recognized in France, that there is this fusion of the French and Belgian. Goemilo was writing in the 50s, the first book about by heart saying, l'erreur de se trouver en mistake of Brussels being that should be in France. Talking about people. But there is this fusion, and also would say Belgium as a France. Belgium, Franco-Belge, but we would say Belgium as a Belgian-French cuisine. And again, this changes because in the 1990s, throughout the world, and so on, so there is this incorporation of exotic elements. Exotic meaning in goulash as well as sushi from Japan, etc. And finally, there is this rediscovery that from today can witness, not just in Belgium, of regional specialities, but they're not just imitated, but they are reinterpreted, visited. So they changed. Just to give one example, this very Belgian dish, tomato with small drinks. I used to have it in my price. It has been revisited, rediscovered and changed now. So this is the place where voilà. I hope this is clear that you know about Belgian cuisine. Definitely has an own. And this is the patients, and then I, but also colleagues of mine, have written on Brussels Belgium. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for this very interesting presentation. We'll have time for some questions. I want to ask a question, well, 2 culinary questions of my own, by the way, because we have been, with the fellows, also been trying to take in a little bit of the Brussels and Belgian food culture. So, of course, the carbonade flamandes and the vol au vin and the boulettes liégeois. But there's also indeed the waterzooi. And that one we've had a lot of difficulty finding. And I read that originally there was one with fish. that was apparently the favorite of Emperor Charles V. Do you know if that is still being, is that still?
There is actually a small discussion going on about what is a real waterzooi, and the answer is very obvious. Waterzooi with fish is the waterzooi that is made in Ghent and France. Waterzooi with chicken is the one that in the. That's it. And actually, it's a very simple stew. Like in many countries, take what you have. And in the 19th century, that would be potatoes, some carrots, and very simple things. If you have fish, mussels, then you put it, and you keep it, you boil it for a couple of hours, and you have you can eat it as soup, as a solid dish. The Emperor Charles V had it. Yeah.
Probably a bit richer. Yeah. And do you know for vol au vin or koninginnenhapje, does that have a local tie to a region, or is it really?
It's French Italian, actually, meaning that the biscuit it's difficult to prepare. It's prepared by all the cooks. It's prepared by pâtissiers who are trained to do that. And it's not easy to make because it's light and it's yeah, it is, but it's prepared with butter, etc. And it's prepared in layers, so it's very delicate to do. It's very fancy. So it was prepared chez à la Reine at the court of France, and then it trickled down to and it was very successful in Brussels. And if you go to France, I don't think you can find easily chez la Reine in the restaurants, or even to buy the biscuits in the supermarket. So it has been acculturated by Belgian cuisine. So, but it's originally 16th, 17th century.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's so much now taken up into what people try to sell you as traditional, and it becomes traditional.
Yeah, it's invented.
Okay, thank you. David, I see you have a question.
Thanks for the presentation. It was amazing. BrIAS tools. The discussion with that's how additional food can be modified by adding ingredients like cellulose, other kind of even good. So that's that. And the different opinion actually is how resilient is. Of course, the same kind of changes in future, and few of these ingredients like chocolate, some other we might be, but you think this to change?
The thing is that it changes all the time, especially since the Second World War. The velocity of changes is. But we don't realize it. Actually, people who read this vanishes not innovate. So we want to keep what we have. And very and my age, I'm much more conservative than things. I used to teach a class to students what you do with bread. That is a couple of days old. Half of the students would say bread. Half would say yes, we have bread, but this thing what you can do with things, right? So this is changing. I'm saying this because actually I don't. Easy to say, oh, but we forced, especially was going Ready-made food, but I see that a lot of kids all that expense for it. Check. Lost. Yeah, so question about chocolate. Bread. Example of what changes in Sudan. Hugely. It's very passionate to see the changes. Then, yeah. That's it. I don't have another answer. That's very.
I was referred to job as the not the solution. Just the advanced technology. That was amazing.
Then already. They were very open to Western influence. Actually, what we know as Japanese food is a mixture. Western food. So then,
That's a subject for
Thank you for your presentation. It was on gastronomy. I have a question. What is the ratio of fast food versus gastronomy?
I don't have the graph with, but I've seen a graph of fast food. And it's an interesting graph starting somewhere in the 1930s, early 2000s. Fast food graph is increasing really, really fast into the 1980s. The traditional eating out in America is declining. Then change occurs, and the reverse is happening. Fast food is stagnating, it's not, but the traditional eating out is again. So this is very hopeful. The other more in the US go outside. Cities like New York are so people go out much more than there is a stagnation. I don't think it's, but I know that in France, it's very badly, but nowadays, France has the biggest concentrations of restaurants. Some of my in the bar. They can't understand. So what's wrong? Education of our children. Different thing. Then much more fast food. Also tourists come. Did much more restaurants that. They know it. So in France, consequence, the figures in France increase. A shock to them. I don't know whether France would be representative as the Europe. So the ratio in France is
Thank you very much. We have one question from the chat from. She would like, could you comment on the different alcohol in urban?
other restaurants, it was only one. It was Tokyo French-style restaurants. BrIAS arrived, restaurants and fancy restaurants. It's very recent phenomenon. Yeah, something from the it was not very well considered. So wine is deeply in the Belgian. So having beer would be
Thank goodness that's changed.
yeah, and also we cook with beer. Kind of beer that you use.
Brown.
Yeah.
I think we use leather.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
As close as possible.
Actually, some people in discussions about type of beer, of course. So it's
Are there any more questions? So not online? Okay, in that case, then we'd like to thank you again, Peter.